this thing about consciousness, conscious plans, conscious purpose, which is never what's going to happen. What's going to happen is going to the extent that we're open to it, it will be better. Stuff emerges in spontaneous play, interplay.
Yeah, how do you see that interplay today?
Einstein did this little bit of work of thinking theory. It seemed very unlike Einstein, but it's really beautiful. He was thinking about how the river flow shapes the river banks and how the river banks shape the river flow.
Mm-hmm.
So beautiful, so clear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly the interaction you're talking about, I think. That we make an artificial intelligence in our own image, but that image is a funhouse mirror. We change ourselves to meet the image halfway through the looking glass. You know, we don't know where it's going to go.
Exactly.
It is, as soon as there's this closure of a circuit, and when you have the two terms, you can call one the figure and one the ground, but then you can go flip and then you get the other point of view. What was ground is now figure, what was figure is ground. Where was I going with that? As soon as there is that relationship and a closure, the input of one is the output of the other, the output of that one is the input of that one. They chase each other around like this. They are self-determining, mutually determining, co-evolutionary would be a good word for it. Behavior emergent in time, and you can't predict what's going to happen. So that is the quintessence of an evolutionary system, of an iterated system, of a dynamical system, like in the 1970s, 80s, we learned about chaos theory. And we saw all those swirly, very fluid-looking images. And everything went infinite. I guess it was 1980, was it? 1980? I think it was 1980 when Mandelbrot first got a plot of the famous Mandelbrot set. Well, it kind of contains all the chaos stuff in it. It is the grand map of chaos theory, which is the grand map of really what they used to call 100-odd years ago, the theory of equations.
Can you give an example of that closure, when the closure happens?
Well, here's one thing. The first thing that comes to mind is Salvador Dali with his paranoid critical method. You're looking at the visual environment. You see shapes, colors, light and dark. You may see things that aren't there, but are just interpretations of what is there. You know, like this microphone with this piece of cloth and that glass. It looks like some kind of bird. That interpretation itself could feed back upon itself, and in fact it must do, for it to cohere as something that I can name, I can designate, I can recognize as a thing. It has already iterated so many times in its own little dynamical system in my nervous system. It reinforced itself. A little bit of evidence says, oh, it's kind of like this, and that suggests to the neighboring, whatever they are.
Can you give such an example with respect to AI and...
I could point to the work that was done, I think 1.5 years, 2 years ago, out of Google. Some engineers at Google, some young pups, bright young things, came up with what they call deep dreaming. And it used what we would call feature detectors, things that recognize little parts of visual images. And it's been trained on huge databases of millions and millions of images. And then beginning with a random seed, a random, like a Rorschach test, like just throwing some ink or color on a surface, and then it starts to see what's there. And that feeds back to itself, which reaffirms what it thinks is there. And then it's into this emerging out of initial random state, out of this initial random chaos, in the classic sense, tohu bohu. You get pagodas turning into what they call slug puppies. You get all this psychedelic imagery, and people saw that and just went, what? Because the last time they'd seen that stuff, they were stoned on LSD. Which just proves what they were saying about Silicon Valley, I guess. But, well, the term psychedelic means mind manifesting. And when we see a deep dreaming image, we are seeing mind manifesting. And the resemblance to the imagery that was seen by people doing psychedelic drugs, or engaged in meditative practices, there's a sensitization to texture and pattern. Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception, he has this wonderful bit where he's talking about the history of Western art is really the history of draperies. Because if you look at, the square inches of paint devoted to draperies as opposed to anything else, it far overwhelms, right? It's just pure abstraction, but nobody saw it. They didn't see it. It's the wallpaper. Wallpaper is inherently very psychedelic. So there is... Oh, and here's something that the Pythagoreans, they would talk about the music of the spheres. And the reason we don't know it's there is because we've heard nothing but that since birth. We are continually hearing the music of the spheres, but we don't know it. Because we're habituated to it, because it's this ongoing, constant thing. And that would be the relationship with these bodies, our own bodies. Mm-hmm. As to what this might mean to an artificial intelligence, I don't know. The whole thing gets a little fishy and weird when we start thinking about, a conscious machine. It's not even necessary to go there, because the only consciousness we can know is the one right here. On the other hand, I can inhabit a machine, I can vicariously augment myself, enhance my own sensorium with extra senses. We can have extrasensory perception. It's artificial. It's a fake.
Let me ask you, if we could simulate human behavior in a machine to the extent that you can't tell whether it is a human or a machine,
Right.
Would you care if your girlfriend, if she was a machine or a real person? Would it make any difference, and why?
I don't know, and I have no...
Yeah.
It's one of those questions. If it happens, then that'll be soon enough to find out what I would do. Gordon Pask had this nice... there was an art show in London in early 1960s called Cybernetic Serendipity, and Gordon Pask, who was an early British cybernetician, designed a piece called The Colloquy of Mobiles, suspended from the ceiling with motors so they could move around. There were male units and female units. The male units had a light, sort of like the male, as, he's shining this big solar light from his center, probing the dark with his light. The female unit is equipped with mirrors, but she has a refined aesthetic sense. She wants to be courted, wooed, sung to, and the male is equipped with vocal organs, so it can also sing. So in order to get his light reflected back to himself, which is really what he wants, he has to con a female unit into cooperating with him.
Yes.
So that's just everything we've been talking about in the last couple of minutes is summed up in that piece of art, right? That's a cybernetic mutual loop. It's the riverbank and the river flow, carving out their own behaviors out of time. Something emergent, something evolutionary, something co-evolutionary, something unanticipable. You don't know what's going to happen. Spontaneous. Spontaneous co-arising. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So, that answers whatever it was you... I'm sure it does.
Yeah.
Whatever it was you asked, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it raises the question, the oldest philosophical question in the book, the question of solipsism. Nobody seems to have a good word for solipsism, right? Solipsism being the philosophical position that only I exist. And other people seem to object strenuously to this assertion. Can't imagine why. Yeah, but no, I've always been very fond of solipsism. I think it rings true to me.
Also.
Well, that we are prisoners in Plato's cave, except there's not just one Plato's cave. Every one of us is trapped in our own unique, idiosyncratic, solipsistic Plato's cave. And the thing about Plato's cave is, he tells a fairy tale about how one guy, one time, manages to break through and go outside, and he's kind of blinded, but then he learns to see, and, he has discovered the real world. Well, it's just the same plot as this Fassbinder film, right? Except we know the fool. It's just another simulation, right? He's just broken through to another simulation. So the transcendence of Plato's cave is the realization that there is no possible transcendence of Plato's cave. It's one of those paradoxes. There's no outside.